the development agencies seem to have a different model for Africa than for the other continents. Why do you think that is?
Well, the truth of the matter is that I believe that development is not really a mystery. It's been now, certainly in my lifetime, without giving away my age, what I will say is I'm older than...
You're a lot younger than me.
I'm older than the life expectancy in Zambia now, which is 37. And so, in my lifetime, we've actually seen things transform quite significantly. I mean, China 20, 30 years ago was poorer than many African countries, and today it's lending to the United States. So miracles can happen, but it's about focused and honest approaches to economic development. I think also I'm really trying, and I think I would say that Professor Easterly, I would pride myself in saying I'm on the side of the truth and logic and evidence, whereas the other side tends to be very focused on emotion. And we are human beings, and of course we are emotional, but to me, emotion should be couched or supported by logic and evidence, which is why I'm very proud to be on the side of Professor Easterly and other people.
Please call me Bill. You're really making me feel old, very old right now.
But I'm very excited to be on the side of people who can take a step back from the emotion and say, what are we really doing here? How can we really transform and innovate, as opposed to people who perhaps have good intentions, but are approaching the African issue from a very emotional point. I would just also like to clarify, because I'm reading stuff in the media and I'm thinking to myself, I didn't say that, I didn't mean that. How come somebody's saying this? And I think it's important for us to clarify what I mean by aid in the context of my book. I'm not talking about humanitarian aid, sort of emergency aid for tsunamis, earthquakes and floods. I think there is a moral imperative there as human beings. If we see people suffering in that manner, I think it's important for us as a global community to actually act. Nor am I talking about NGOs or charities. I sit on a number of charity boards myself, and we can talk about them in detail later. And so this is not about NGOs. Although these two types of aid do have problems, and it's quite widely known, a lot of people have written on these critiques of these issues, such as the fact that it tends to be quite laden with bureaucracy themselves, so implementation becomes difficult. Also, there have been criticisms of the fact that certainly in the case of NGOs, perhaps there's not a transfer of capacity, so it creates a dependency cycle. But those type of issues are not dealt with in this book, because this book is actually really focused on the third type of aid, which is really the government-to-government transfers and sort of multilateral institution to government transfers. And I think this is really important. And if there's one thing that I would ask you to take away from this discussion, it's that point, because I think there will increasingly and unfortunately be people who will say, oh, that Dambisa Moyo would prefer to see babies in Africa die. That's not my stance. I'm really trying to come up with a solution, and as Bill and many others who are working in this area are, that's going to be a permanent solution to see Africa really achieve long-term economic success and reduce poverty. So.
Well, the other thing that I think everyone in the audience wants to ask you is, what do you think of Bono? Bono, let's see if we can try to make a case for Bono and then have you respond. Bono has, and his sort of celebrity collaborators like Angelina Jolie and Madonna and other expert development economists
he said it, not I, just for the record.
If you could try to think of any positive case for them, you could say that they have been enormously successful in calling a lot of attention to Africa's issues, to working on African issues, to working on African poverty. But I think you see a downside, so tell us what you think of Bono.
Yeah, again, I think that this is a red herring. I have some views about the celebrities, which I'll come to in a second, but I think the whole conversation about celebrities is kind of, it's incidental to the issue of Africa and what Africa can and will do and should be doing. to answer specifically, I think my fundamental problem with the celebrity culture broadly, it's not just about Bono specifically, is that I think that they're wrong in their fundamental approach to ask for more aid to Africa, which very often they do. I think also it's problematic and in a sense, an artifact of the aid model, and we can get into more detail about this, that they actually have taken over the space of becoming the face of Africa and spokespeople on behalf of the African continent. It begs the question, where is the African leadership? Many Africans, I'm sure, here will be quite familiar with how difficult it is to stand under the hot African sun waiting to vote for a leader. And so what's the point of having a democratic society, albeit perhaps in a nascent form, if at the end of the day somebody else outside of Africa is designing the future of the continent? It's akin, as I've been quoted as saying, to having Obama not say much about the capital markets or what's going on in the credit crisis in the United States, and having an international musician such as, I don't know, Amy Winehouse perhaps, commenting on that. I cannot envisage a situation where Americans would tolerate that. And I think in the same vein, Africans should be upset. Where are the African leaders? We need to hear from them about what exactly their plan is for this population of Africans coming out. And I guess the last thing I would say about the whole celebrity culture, it's not just them. I think that many of us are guilty of this, is that their whole approach to, if you will, helping Africa is couched in negativity. You don't hear them stand up and say, you know what, actually, things are tough on this continent, but guess what? There's some pockets of positivity. Africa has a female president. That's an interesting story. Why don't we talk about that? It has a central bank governor who is a woman. That's also an interesting story. What about the fact that there are now 15 stock markets across the continent? 16 countries have credit ratings. It's not perfect, but there are some pockets of positivity on this continent. So, it does bother me that we would rather focus on what I call the four horsemen of Africa's apocalypse, which are war, disease, poverty, and corruption. That's the story. Everybody wants to have the photo op with the baby starving, and there are elements of that for sure. But the world is asking us as Africans to raise our children on this continent under a very negative perspective. And it's couched in pity. And any psychologist or psychiatrist would tell you that if you tell somebody constantly that they're not good enough, they're not equal, they're not the same, they're poor, they're not going to amount to anything, they need to be helped, that can't be a formula for long-term sustainable development. So I think that, and perhaps I'm wrong on this, but in my mind, when I think of the efforts of the celebrities, I find that by and large they're couched in a very negative approach to Africa. They don't tend to encourage or to uphold what I see as some very positive signs across the continent.